Did you know that cheese rolling, underground raves, and even the ice bucket challenge are all folklore? Or that rumors spreading through your social media feed follow the exact same patterns as World War I trench gossip?
Today we're diving into the living, breathing world of folklore with two distinguished scholars from the University of Hertfordshire, Professor Owen Davies and Dr. Ceri Houlbrook, co-authors of the new book, Folklore, A Journey Through the Past and Present.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack.
Professor Owen Davies of the University of Hertfordshire is one of the world's leading experts on the history of witchcraft, magic, ghosts, and popular medicine, with decades of groundbreaking research into how supernatural beliefs shape society.
Dr. Houlbrook is a senior lecturer in folklore and history at the University of Hertfordshire, specializing in contemporary folklore and the material culture of ritual. Basically, all the things we do today without realizing they're folklore.
We'll explore how folklore connects to witch hunts and how social media has supercharged the spread of folklore.
Plus, we get into the juicy stuff, like how rumor and legend fuel witch accusations, why folklore practices ended up in the Salem courtrooms, and what it means when an excavated cat skeleton becomes a witch cat in the headlines.
It's a fascinating conversation that'll change how you see the everyday customs, stories, and beliefs all around you. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts, Dr. Ceri Houlbrook, and welcome back, Professor Owen Davies. Please tell us about your specialized expertise and interests.
Do you want to go for Ceri?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in folklore and history, but despite the history in the title, I'm mainly interested in contemporary folklore, things that we do today in our everyday lives, things that we don't recognize as folklore. Hopefully you will once you read the book. But yeah, kind of how folklore adapts as society changes, culture changes, how it's always adapted and how it's going to continue adapting. I'm also really interested in the material culture of ritual. So how we can kind of gain insights into people's beliefs and traditions and rituals through looking at the kind of tangible objects that they're engaging with and how they're engaging in the landscapes. So yeah, there's a main interests.
Yeah, and most of my work is on history of the supernatural, witchcraft, magic, ghosts, but also in the fields of popular medicine, folk medicine, and also popular religion. You can't understand witchcraft, magic, and ghosts unless you also explore the history of religion as well.
And we were fortunate, Owen, to meet you last year at the Witchcraft and Human Rights Conference at Lancaster University. And we really appreciate you coming out and giving a keynote there.
Yeah, that was a very interesting event. And thanks to you both also for the ways in which you're organising our international sort of set of interested organisations and groups around contemporary witchcraft and the abuse of women and children. So you're doing a fine job as well.
Thank you.
So how did Folklore, A Journey Through the Past and Present come together?
Well, it came really from teaching on the Folklore Studies Master's Programme. We're in the 7th year of this programme running now. It's the only one in England. And our students would ask before the course started a key text that we could recommend for them that covered kind of the main topics that we'd be looking at in the Masters. And even though there are thousands of books on folklore, most of them excellent books on folklore, they're either kind of very, very focused in on a particular element of folklore, or they're very focused in on a particular geographical region. That might be the folklore of a certain county or kind of England or Wales or Scotland specifically. And they're also quite narrow in terms of time. So they kind of get a snapshot of folklore in a particular century, a particular period. What we wanted to do with folklore was to show how dynamic and current folklore is. As I said, to show how folklore has always adapted and will continue to adapt and is just as much alive today as it was in the past. And to really kind of cover, I mean, not all folklore topics, but the main ones that we teach and the main ones that we specialize in. There will always be gaps. We couldn't possibly cover everything. Things like folk dance, folk music have been so well covered in other publications that we didn't think we could do justice to them in just a single chapter. And other things like folk religion, for instance, we did consider having a chapter that was just focused on folk religion, but because that comes up in nearly all the other subjects, we've let that kind of be a thread that runs throughout the whole book. So yeah, long story short, the MA led to the book.
There's also at the moment in the last few years in Britain, there's been a groundswell, a sort of revival of interest in folklore since the last one, which was in the 1970s. So there has been huge numbers of books. Most of them, as Ceri was saying, aren't particularly analytical, but a lot of them are coming from a kind of very good, this is not criticism, but coming from a kind of creative angle. People looking and traveling the landscape, looking for significance and meaning. And obviously this groundswell is partly tied to concerns over environmentalism, people wanting to connect with folklore as an aspect of the environment and landscape. There's also a time when in England in particular, there's a groundswell of nationalism. And as in many other countries, nationalists do tend to try and draw upon what they consider to be true, authentic folklore of the English. So we do use the book to explore Englishness in relationship to Scottishness and Welshness and the ways in which identity is shaped and draws upon folklore.
I appreciated the overall context, but as Ceri, you pointed out the threads that you pull through these focused chapters, but this overall context, I feel like was a really key element of this book, the showing the cycle and the revival and dying off. Was that part of the point of this collection, to create a bigger context?
Absolutely, to show really that you can't look at folklore in isolation. You can't look at one element of folklore without thinking about how other elements have developed, without thinking about how society is developing and what changes we're experiencing. So yeah, it was trying to bring it all together, and it can be read a chapter. You can just dip into it and just read one chapter standalone. But hopefully, yeah, that message of kind of the dynamic, the political nature of folklore and the constantly adapting nature of folklore ties the chapters together.
We have a line in the introduction which basically says, after they're reading this book, people might start realizing that what they're doing is folklore, because the idea is that actually people are shaped by folklore, whether it's an intimate level or a domestic level or national level or regional level, and people are doing things which folklorists would go, well, that's folklore, but the people doing it aren't necessarily realizing that or thinking in those terms anyway.
On that note, what does folklore actually mean? What is included? What might somebody be doing that they don't realize is folklore?
And over to Ceri on that one.
Yeah, I have a kind of pithy definition of folklore, but it's too short really for what it covers. But if people want a very, very quick definition, then it is the customs we practice, the stories we tell, and the beliefs we hold. But obviously, beliefs, when does religion become folklore? So those lines are very, very blurred. Stories that we're telling, when does that kind of a memory, your kind of retelling of something that happened to you, when does that become folklore? Again, a blurred line. And the same with customs. Does a practice have to have no kind of practical function in order for us to interpret it as folklore or not? So yeah, that's my short definition, but really there is so many things that are and aren't included, and it's also really subjective. I think every folklorist would have a slightly different opinion of what is considered folklore, and that is also changing. What we see as folklore today is very, very different to what people were seeing as folklore 100 years ago. That's why we were so reluctant to write a definition in the book, because we know that any definition will eventually become outdated. You will need to add other things, look at it from a different angle. And in our first draft, there was no definition. We just wanted people to read the content and come up with their own idea of what they thought folklore was, based on what we believe it is. But yeah, after the peer review came back and they said, no, you need a definition. So yeah, we put in a definition, but we kept it quite broad.
Yeah. I mean, American folklorists have spent, decades trying to define what folklore is. There's a whole screeds and screeds of articles, debate amongst American folks in particular. British folklore has a very different trajectory in terms of it has no academic footing. So there's been less sort of soul searching over the definitions of folklore in British folklore as there has been in American folklore, where it's well established in academic discipline.
Yeah, I really appreciated reading your book for me as American is a cultural experience, and it did make me more curious about American folklore heritage, reading your introduction. And so I'm excited to learn more about what's uniquely a British tradition, what's uniquely an American tradition, even though I did get the message that our traditions have really been fed from different cultures in space.
Part of that is the American experience was obviously very distinct. It's not going to say unique, because the same thing happens in Australia, where you get the encounter between indigenous peoples and Europeans, and the same thing obviously happens in North America. And that brings it, in those contexts, brings very quite interesting dynamics. And actually to compare Australia with America is really interesting in terms of the ways in which, obviously, place names in America, loads of place names which are of indigenous origin, and which then Europeans didn't really understand what they were, so they made basically English or German sort of understandings, which are a classic bit of folklore about finding a legend that explains the name, because the name itself is not part of the language. So you do get these really interesting traditions. But what we do in the book also is looking at the ways in which, and I've done it in other work as well, the ways in which some aspects of folklore is like translate and migrate to the States and others don't. And that in itself is a really interesting area of why that happens. Sorry, Ceri, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say it's actually really interesting to speak to American readers of our book, because we're both British, and the examples that we included, we're quite familiar with them. And writing it, there was this assumption that a lot of our readers would know at least some of the customs that we're writing about and have some idea in their mind, and hopefully that we could have made them reconsider the history of them. But to actually have it read by someone who's not from Britain, it'd be interesting to know which customs you were familiar with and which ones were completely new to you.
I was really informed by your book about the ritual year framework, and a lot of the things that were in there I was seeing for the first time, even though, I mean, we have a calendar year and holidays, government holidays and religious holidays. That was a really fresh way for me to look at a year. But one of the things that stuck out to me were these work fairs and how that had evolved, because that's such a big part of our culture now is work fairs, and now they're online. So even that's an example of transition in time, because I know media and the internet's a part of folklore. So that stuck out to me. What about you, Josh?
Yeah, basically, at least half of what was in the book was new to me as an American, because those ones didn't translate over across the sea to us. And there were just so many. There's cheese rolling. I don't know anybody in America who does a cheese. We do lots of things like pumpkin smashing and pumpkin launching, but no cheese rolling.
Part of the discussion really is that a lot of customs are quite localized. They may be on the same point in the year because of the religious calendar, because of the markets and fair calendar, etc., or charitable calendar, but different traditions get shaped in different ways in a localized and regionalized level. So you do get customs which are across the country, like traditional football, which is played between villages or two different parts of a town, which is quite a violent game, which didn't really translate, partially because it was being suppressed in the 19th century when most Europeans were migrating to the States. So it doesn't come that way. But yeah, there's kind of two different things going on. One is the migration of the Scots, the Welsh, and the English to North America and elsewhere, to South America and to different parts of the empire. And they bring with them aspects to preserve their own identity. And that normally sheds all the stuff which has got to do with drinking and aspects of festivity. It's a more decorous sort of form of the folklore that ends up in America and Australia, etc. There's some complex processes going on.
I just have to share this one little tidbit that just jumped in my mind, Owen, when you were talking about the football. So I'm here in Colorado, and there's this daily podcast Colorado Public Radio puts out every day. It's a few minutes, 10 or 15 minutes. And yesterday they were covering, basically it was a tunnel rave that popped up. Ravers wanted to have an unsanctioned, unofficial rave where they could get that experience from the 90s, the underground music dance. And they actually covered it on the podcast, and they talked about the police showing up, apologizing for having to shut it down. And then they, of course, use the opportunity to talk about a very tragic incident where something went very wrong in the past with one of these, to warn against doing such a thing. But that just, it's that suppression and pushing back for culture that we just see it everywhere you turn if you're looking. Yeah, people want to come together and do what they want.
Yeah, one of our former MA students did a really good assignment based around underground rave culture. Basically, he was taking a folkloristic lens and looking at sort of the rituals and the reactions, exactly as you're explaining, Sarah. The reactions to it, the reason why it's underground is based around a whole series of tropes regarding young people and what's meant to be illicit behavior, and obviously drugs as well. But yeah, you can study exactly that from a folkloristic lens and with a historical sort of gaze on it as well.
How does the modern mass media accelerate the development of folklore beliefs and interest in folklore?
Hugely so. Absolutely huge. I mean, it's not only kind of sped up the transmission, but it's just globalized it. That idea of folk groups aren't geographical really anymore. You can be a member of a folk group with somebody who lives in a different continent to you, and you can be sharing lore with them within seconds. And you just think, when things go viral, you know, how rapidly and widely they spread. Things like what we write about in the book, the Ice Bucket Challenge, for instance. I mean, that was big in America as well, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
And kind of how huge that very, very quickly became. And, you know, it's for a good cause, but it was also quite ritualistic behavior if you think about somebody just sitting there and having somebody pour ice cold water on you. And then you're daring somebody else to do it. So it's almost like a chain letter of dares. So kind of very, very folkloric behavior that just became huge so quickly because of social media. So yeah, Americans have been ahead of this, ahead of the Brits in terms of recognizing that folklore online is worthy of study. We're catching up, but yeah, it's really not necessarily changed the kind of folklore that's being created and changed, just slightly changed the form, certainly changed the speed and the breadth of transmission.
It's also supercharged conspiracy theory, which in folkloristic terms we might consider to be rumour legends. And rumour legends have been studied since the First World War. You know, the First World War was considered to be a laboratory of the ways in which rumour spread through the trenches and then found its way back to the home front. So people were studying that at the time on both sides of the conflict. So this has long been an area of interest for folklorists. But today, with social media, you know, just literally within minutes and hours, it's popping into people's social media, for millions of people's social media. But at the core of it is kind of classic, same old sort of, say, rumor legends, or what we call friend of a friend tales, FOAF tales. And I've seen loads of what sort of American ones, particularly, obviously, with the political atmosphere in America. There's a lot of conspiracy theory floating around. But I've seen some classic ones about, my friend told me about his brother who works at the Pentagon, and he says, you know, and immediately that can go viral. And obviously UFO stuff, you know, that I was down at whatever, Area 52 and blah, blah, blah. But it's always a friend of a friend. It's never direct. This is classic folklore stuff. And you can see it in real time happening across the world, not just in America or Britain, but across the world because of social media. But also the concern is obviously politically is how this stuff, because it is so easily spread, what are the negative consequences of that? Dark folklore.
Yeah, and it's almost like they pile on top of each other. Like there's not even time for, I mean, they do get their feet, but as soon as there's just like another one, it's just
relentless.
So
It can be relentless. Yeah, particularly when most in historical context, yes, rumor legends were put around for propaganda reasons. When they say in the First World War or in the Second World War, we see plenty of examples in which rumor legends are spread to undermine morale in the other side. But again, it's the concentration of it now, and the ways in which, you know, is so you don't need a whole propaganda machine to get a rumor going as you would have done 60, 70 years ago. Now one person in his bedroom can set things rolling very quickly, as the founder of QAnon did.
Yeah.
But we're
what a great-
seeing what, if you think about, I'm not an expert in kind of the beliefs in witchcraft, but historically it was these kinds of rumors that were causing a huge amount of damage to people. And you're seeing the same, but on such a wider, faster scale. Yeah. So that idea of damaging rumors that spread very quickly through a community, whether that's a very local community or a global community, has a very, very long history.
Sarah and I were actually talking about a bit of dark folklore transmitted in our age. There's in Papua New Guinea, there's sorcery accusation related violence where there are witch hunts going on. But we've heard from people in Papua New Guinea that there was also a period of Dracula hunts because the movie Dracula had been imported into the country and people were looking for vampires.
That's one of those classic example of cultural transmission, whereby you see that in a non-dark form. The founders of manga, for example, were really interested in European and classical myth. And so actually, in a benign way, if you look at a lot of manga for 60s, 70s and today, you'll find a lot of kind of ways in which they're drawing upon European or classical types of monster, for example. So you can see how these, as you're saying, with a Dracula or whatever, bloodsuckers can easily be drawn into other cultures through cultural contact.
Speaking of witch hunts, how does folklore intersect with witch hunts?
Oh,
Over to you.
Multiple, yeah, well, no, it's multiple levels, isn't it? Ceri was just bringing it up, the point about rumour and how rumours spread. Obviously, that's fundamental to many witchcraft accusations, particularly, if you look at a lot of classical sorts of accusations in a place like England, which has a common law, as it does in America, and you see the witness statements from witch trials, you can see it's 15 up to 30 years worth of people having experiences and suspicions of that person. And you read those depositions and go, well, 15 years ago, I was walking past the house and suddenly I went lame or whatever, boom. So people dredge all of this stuff up, which has been discussed and circulated within the family or elsewhere. For that one moment when an accusation is formally made, it kind of unlocks decades worth, sometimes, not always, but it can do, unlike decades worth of rumour that has circulated of what Ceri was talking about, memorates, the idea is the ways in which an actual experience, often of the supernatural, ends up becoming a bit of folklore, and then on the process gets embroidered on the way. And you see all this sort of mixing up in some of these accusations. So, that aspect of it is really important. Obviously, there's the archetype. We talk about that in the book, the stereotype, the stereotypical witch. I think in the book, I'm banging on these kind of three typology of witches for decades now. But anyway, one of my typologies is the kind of folkloric witch. And these people, these classic stereotypical ones who look the part, live the part, so to speak, are rarely ones who actually end up in accusations in terms of formal accusations or trials. But they're there, and we can find them in 17th century sources, whether it's here or continent. There are these people who are living out lives under the suspicion of witchcraft, but it's in a more folkloric way, which, as I say, sometimes never gets to the point of accusation, but they are witch-like. So that's really quite important for understanding witch trials, having that folkloristic perspective on it.
I was thinking, in Salem, we have a lot of those examples of 17 years ago, so-and-so told me if I ever cheated them again, they would stick to me like the bark on a tree, or they told me to go to the devil 25 years ago. And I was thinking that those like memorates, they create a legend of the person that's being accused of witchcraft. You have this whole folklore around what the person is capable of and what things people have witnessed in the past.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the folk tests that were happening in the courts in New England, but specifically Salem, with the magistrates having touch tests and working with puppets. Why do you think that these practices had legal authority, folklore practices having legal authority?
Depends which ones we're talking about. If it's cruentation, which is essentially a trial by blood, in other words, you touch the body and it bleeds, and that is proof. Or you've got swimming witches, of course, as well as another one, or weighing on the church Bible. all these things are only quasi-official. They're not. It's not formally evidence that is recognised by courts generally. But the juries in these trials, they may be of a certain status, obviously, but they have to be on the juries. But at the same time, they are part of their community, and they do share the same sets of beliefs and ideas as the people accused and people who are making the accusations. So there are a shared set of ideas and beliefs which transcend social level and education, but they're generally not specific. I mean, swimming witches is the classic one, which, yes, the evidence does get introduced into courtrooms, but at the same time is usually, certainly later on, dismissed or not really taken into account as a trial. But it's discussed and it's talked about, etc. So, yeah, we sometimes over-exaggerate social differentiations based on property with distinctions of a cultural or belief level or tradition level where things are shared.
And I imagine, again, I'm not an expert, but I imagine in this kind of quite uncertain situations, they were relying on what they believed they knew. They relied on those folk beliefs that they'd had up until that time. And as Owen said, that kind of those beliefs will have just cut across class. And even if they weren't making it into the official verdicts and things, they would have been part of people's thought processes, because you do, when you're in an uncertain situation, you fall back on what you believe you know.
And people are also, in those trials, people are, those who are making the accusations, those who are witnesses in court, having their depositions taken, they're making decisions about what they say, how they say it, what beliefs are acceptable or not acceptable. And again, if you look in a British context in an English context, I should be more specific, where there's no torture involved, apart from the Matthew Hopkins era, you very rarely get talk about, I saw the witch flying over my house, or the witch flew here, or a witch flew there. Now, but if you look at folklore of the period, it's a common thing. And again, the folkloric witch is one of the key properties of folklore, so they can do that. They can fly around. But people are clearly, when it comes to making formal legal accusations, are going, well, but maybe that's probably not the sort of evidence that is going to get me to where I want, which is to get rid of the witch. So again, we sometimes don't think through the ways in which what people are saying in those court records is carefully calculated. We need to give agency to these people, no matter how unpleasant it is that they hold in these beliefs and trying to get someone executed. It's all about strategizing.
We encounter a lot of myths about witch trials and witch hunts when we're interacting. So I feel like there's this whole folklore that's sprung up about the folklore, the meta level of folklore. But some things we get are, in Salem, they burned the witches. In Salem, they were accusing because of ergot, and they were all poisoned and drugged out of their minds. Things like that. Are those kinds of explanations that arise of things? Are those typical of how popular explanations become embedded in lore?
Well, I mean, the idea of folklore is an interesting one. I think there's lots of examples, isn't there, Ceri, of the ways in which folklore is consciously or subconsciously developed for a purpose. It's not organic. It is actually someone's thinking about the creation of X legend or X custom or X ritual. We tend to think of it organic, as though somehow it springs from the earth,
Yeah, so often you may not be able to trace the kind of the origins of a piece of folklore, but they will have been shaped by a person with an agenda, whatever that agenda was. It could have just been like, I'm going to create something so that my family can have a good time. Or it could be a political agenda, it could be religious. So it's individuals and groups who are consciously creating a lot of the folklore. And how it changes tends to be more organic. But I think that idea. And also, as I'm sure you'll know, People love the idea of witches. They want to see them in so much of the kind of mystery that they've come across in history. So much so that there is that folklore of witchcraft that's so firmly embedded. I remember some years ago on Pendle Hill in Lancashire, there was the ruins of a cottage was found, and within that was a cat, the remains of a cat. And that instantly, in popular imagination and in print, that was a witch's cat. So even though there was no evidence to support the connection between this kind of ruin and the Pendle witch trials, and also no evidence to suggest that witches had cats, this just became the narrative, and you saw it in newspapers, social media, because people love that idea, rather than seeing this cottage ruined where a cat possibly accidentally crawled into an airtight space and couldn't get out again, and that's why it's there, or it was a beloved pet who was buried there. No, it's a witch's cat. Because people love that. People find the mystery and the magic very appealing, and that's how folklore can be created. And again, we have that agenda. I don't know who found it, and I'm not sure who was the first person to write about it, but that was going to sell papers more than cat remains found in ruins. Having that word witch, a headline, that will have sold papers, that will have generated interest. So again, we have that agenda creating folklore. So yeah, you see that in so many things.
You're speaking of cats actually reminded me of an example from the last major election in the US. There was the rumor of people eating cats, specifically the Haitian, in Springfield, Ohio. There was that rumor because it started with the missing cat flyer. And then somehow that got connected because it was politically expedient. It was the agenda was immigrants are bad. So that rumor was able to spread all over the country just based on nothing.
Yeah, no. And several American folklorists quickly got onto their podcasts about that one because they were basically saying this is a classic folkloric trope of sort of outrageous, whether it's cannibalism or eating animals and dogs. It's an old one. You can trace it back centuries. So yeah, folklorists were immediately going, oh God, here comes that one again, and was sadly quite effective. That's the power of it. It's instantly picking up, knowing how you're going to pick up on certain motifs, which will basically provoke certain types of emotional reaction or fear. Boom. That's the effect. But you've got to know your folklore to do it properly.
We saw it with Brexit. Folklore they created about the EU as the evil overlords. And again, it worked. It worked. It was successful, sadly.
But that was deliberately seeded for political purposes and by the British right-wing press. So basically, they were people like Boris Johnson were making up stuff which become essentially legends, but he was making it up for bashing the EU. So things like bendy bananas, that we had the things that the EU was going to ban bendy bananas and we could only get straight bananas. That's a classic bit of folklore, but behind it is a very pernicious intent. And these things tend to then permeate and start getting made on from the ground level as well. So there was an example that in another thing I wrote about ice cream vans, and in the early 2000s, in the northeast of England, there's a type of red raspberry sauce which is called monkey blood, and it's only known as monkey blood in northeastern England. But anyway, someone was asking for some monkey blood on their ice cream from an ice cream van, and the bloke going, sorry mate, it's been banned by the EU, which is absolute rubbish. They're saying we can't call it monkey blood anymore because the EU, we can't say monkey blood. Which is absolute rubbish. The EU really has not got their ear to the ground about the northeast dialect and ice cream monkey blood. But there you go. It spreads and other aspects of it develop.
I'm just soaking it in for a second. I just love it. I love this. And in my journey as a podcaster and as an advocate for witch hunts, the presentation you gave at the Folklore Society about your article on the ice cream trucks.
Oh, yeah.
That was a moment where I was realizing what folklore was. Like, I was still looking back and thought it was heritage. And this was a couple of years ago, so it's changed so much for me. But I just was so fascinated with that research. And I was like, oh my goodness, everything's folklore. So that was like one of those light bulb moments for me.
Good. Glad it did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. There's some folklore in the book that I'm familiar with because I believed it, at least as a child. Things like the earwigs going into your ears. I used to be afraid of that happening at night, and other things like if you swallow an apple seed, it's going to grow in your belly and you're going to have a tree coming out your mouth. It's absurd looking back on some of that, but I bought into it. It's everyday kind of things.
But also children inventing their own stuff, don't they, Ceri? You know?
Oh, yeah. Right. So I distinguish between kind of the folklore that we often associate with children, the things like carving pumpkins or writing letters to Father Christmas, Santa. But actually, so much of what children do, and so many of the stories that they tell, familiar with at least, are instigated by adults. So the adult will sit them down and say, let's write a letter to Santa. The adult will tell them a fairy tale or sing them a nursery rhyme, and that kind of enters their consciousness. Child law is something different. Child law is the law that is passed from child to child without adult intervention, often without adults knowing about it or approving of it. There are so many examples of this just in the playground of rhymes that children tell. I don't know whether 6-7 is still a big thing in America. Yes, it's absolutely
6-7.
6-7, everything 6-7. And nobody really knows what it means, and the children don't know what it means. But I dropped my son off at school, and it's written on all the walls. People have written the condensation, and I think the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, said it in a school the other week, and was told, no, we don't say that, we don't encourage that. What's really interesting is that that's an example of child law. That's just children doing it, and it's kind of part of their language, part of their expression, and yet it's being banned in schools, which is bizarre to me because it's not offensive, it doesn't hurt anybody. But there are so many things flying around online of kind of videos of Santa saying, well, any child who says 6-7 isn't getting presents this year. And so we're utilizing folklore, the folklore of Father Christmas and Santa, to actually suppress child law, to say, no, you're a bad boy or girl if you say 6-7. So, yeah, I find that kind of interplay between folklore and kind of adult use of folklore and child law, which for some reason is really getting on adults' nerves when it's just a bunch of numbers. Yeah, I feel quite strongly about this. Yeah, I'm going to march into my son's school and be like, why are you banning the use of 6-7? It's just, yeah. But I find that the fact how quickly that spread and how widely it's known. I don't know if you have Elf on the Shelf in America, the cheeky elf. Yeah. So I've seen so many pictures from the cheeky elf and what they're up to these days. And they're adopting 6-7. So many cheeky elves now are writing 6-7 on walls across households and holding up playing cards 6-7. We've got an example there of child law that's partly being suppressed by adults, but also adults who are looking for a cheeky elf idea. Again, drawing on child law. So yeah, I woke up with 6-7 written on my cheek in lipstick this morning because the cheeky elf was at it again.
That is so fun. Yeah, it's definitely like you can't get away from it. It's on the radio, and it's like the adults are complaining. I think some of the youth are like, why are you sticking your nose in here? Like, you think you know now, but you don't. It's been really fun for me to watch it. I have a young teenager, and in our household, I knew I was like already like before it blew up, I was kind of like using it to just code my son a little bit because he thought, well, you don't know what you're talking about, Mom, but it's just so fun. So I have thoroughly enjoyed that. I wonder, is there an element to children aren't allowed to have agency with a term that I didn't make up? Like, is there that play between the generations there? And isn't there all this generation strife too? Boomers and millennials like that. I've really enjoyed that, what's going on with that too. It's interesting how that is playing out.
Yeah I think it's this kind of case of, well, it doesn't mean anything and that's why it's annoying, but it means something to the children even if they can't articulate it. It's almost like this secret language and only some people are cool enough to say it. So yeah, I think it's that lack of understanding. We don't get it, so you shouldn't be allowed to do it.
Yeah, and there's a long history of this being done. I remember famous author Robert Southey, was early 19th century, and a craze went around London whereby young people were writing quoz on walls, Quoz, quoz. And everyone's going, what's quaz? What's quaz? What does this mean? And it's spread. So the quaz, and you've got all these middle class people. What the earth is going on here? I don't understand this. But that was exactly the point again. That was exactly the point. It was a kind of code, and the whole point was to provoke, but at the same time had no ostensible meaning to it. So quaz.
Let's get it back up again. Let's get it started.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, be a nice way to start a little panic. What is quaz? Is this? It's terrorists. Who knows what this
That's
is?
right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm sure that would get into rumor legend, would turn it into some sort of conspiracy. Style,
everything's a conspiracy now. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we're nearing the end, so I just wanted to see, is there anything we haven't covered today that you wanted to express?
Ooh, there's lots more in the book. We've got chapters on folk medicine. We've got chapters on folklore of the natural world. We've got stuff on looking at early media history and the influence of the BBC on people's understanding of folklore. And lots of sort of pertinent contemporary resonance with notions of identity and folklore as well. So yeah, there's lots in there.
I'll be giving it a reread soon. It's this complete work, but you can just take it a chapter at a time. And as I was going through it, trying to pack it in and process it, I was like making little bookmarks. I'm going back to this. I'm going back to this. Because there was so much that is so important that's in there that will help me look at things that I care about and I'm researching.
That was good.
Good.
Great to hear. Good endorsement.
Thank you.
I thought of just another one that stood out to me in there with the nature folklore was around the cuckoo bird.
Oh yeah.
I wasn't familiar with the cuckoo bird changing into a whole other kind of bird in the winter. So that explains why you don't see them
Exactly,
in winter. That it kind of makes a little sense to it.
Well, exactly. A lot of that lore makes sense within the context of the time. I mean, it's only in the late 18th century that anyone understood migration fully. So a lot of that folklore is, in one sense, common sense trying to make sense of the things around you, but it just happens to be completely wrong. But within the context of knowledge, it's a kind of a rational thought process. I think a lot of folklore, which in the past it's about trying to explain things simply. And at one degree, I think we've kind of lost a bit of that, which ties it back into stuff I've written about witchcraft and people going, why? I always used to tell my students, you've got to think like the time when your car breaks down. Do you think, why is it broken down here? Why did it break down at 12:01? People don't. You just call your rescue. But if your cartwheel broke, that's just what you'd think. My cartwheel broke. Why did it break there? Why was it there? Why did it just happen now? Why today? Why at this time of day? So anyway, that's just an insight into the ways in which we're trying to understand how folklore is created and how people thought in the past. Then folklore is a good way of getting into that.
And how much do we think we know now that's going to turn out to be
folklore
in 100 years' time? That's something I would like to be around to find out.
Thank you so very much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, George. Thank you,
Thank
Sarah.
you for having us.
Thank you. What an incredible conversation. I hope you're as fascinated by folklore as we are now.
Folklore, A Journey Through the Past and Present by Professor Owen Davies and Dr. Ceri Houlbrook is available for you to read now. You can even pick it up at bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhunts, our bookshop, and support our projects.
Both experts have extensive bodies of research worth exploring. Professor Davies' work on witchcraft and magic history is essential reading for anyone interested in these topics. And Dr. Houlbrook's research on contemporary folklore and material culture offers fresh perspectives on the rituals and customs all around us.
Thanks so much for listening to The Thing About Witch Hunts. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.